Se eu comprar um cinema, eu me gravo no videogame, acredito que eu só poder vir. Eu tô fazendo muito mais. Eu por isso eu faço assim, cara. Só que ele vai ser afetado. Eu preciso, se for provar,
boa tarde a todos. Antes de darmos continuidade às atividades, eu tenho alguns avisos. Queremos lembrar a todos que após a palestra do palestrante Charles Wood, todos deverão devolver os registros e retirar os seus documentos. Certo? Informamos também que a palestra da palestrante foi cancelada. A palestrante teve um imprevisto e, portanto, a palestra foi cancelada. A palestra da Elizabeth Zucoloto, História dos Meteoritos Brasileiros, será transferida do auditório da face para a sala 309. Então, às 15 horas, nós teremos, paralelamente a atividades aqui deste espaço, nós teremos na sala 309 a palestra da palestrante Elizabeth sobre a história dos meteoritos brasileiros. Então, reforçando, não teremos a palestra Ensino de Astronomia para Crianças, e aí pedimos a compreensão de todos por essa alteração de última hora no roteiro do evento. Queremos lembrar também a todos que às 19 horas está programada a atividade Estação Espaço do Conhecimento na Praça da Liberdade. Nós pedimos a todos que, após, ao final das atividades, até o final das atividades, os interessados deverão fazer a inscrição, porque essa atividade só irá comportar 60 participantes. Então, pedimos aos interessados que, o mais breve possível, façam a inscrição na entrada deste teatro, na mesa com a recepcionista. Lembrando, portanto, que só temos 60 lugares para a atividade Estação e Espaço do Conhecimento, que acontecerá na Praça da Liberdade. Lembramos também que os participantes interessados deverão assumir o transporte para o local. É um local perto, para quem não conhece a cidade, fica perto aqui do nosso endereço, e aí vocês podem se organizar em grupos e talvez, enfim, utilizarem o táxi para chegar até o local. Então, lembrando que para a participação poderá ser feita, portanto, a inscrição, 60 lugares. Alguma dúvida? Então, vamos dar continuidade às atividades do ENAST. Nós teremos agora a palestra O Objeto Mais Fascinante do Céu Noturno, com o palestrante Charles Wood. Para quem se interessar, no hall do auditório encontram-se, portanto, os rádios para tradução. Quem não os retirou poderá fazê-lo neste momento. Charles Wood cresceu no início da era espacial. Quando era estudante do ensino médio, conheceu o projeto
aqui, lá na frente, não, né?
E construiu um telescópio com um espelho de 5 polegadas que ele mesmo poliu. Na universidade, Wood trabalhou no laboratório Lunar e planetário Gerard Kepler, e também foi coautor do catálogo e mapa denominado o Sistema das Crateras Lunares. Ele completou seu PhD em Geologia Planetária e desde então trabalhou nessa área. Wood publicou 3 livros sobre a Lua e um sobre vulcões da América do Norte. Ele é coordenador do grupo de trabalho sobre nomenclatura lunar da União Astronômica Internacional. Wood publica uma coluna sobre a Lua para a revista Sky and Telescope desde 1998 e criou os sites The Moon Wiki e Lunar Photo of the Day, LPOD, o qual foi atualizado diariamente de 2004 até 2015. Convidamos ao palco o palestrante.
Wow, I had so many things in my hand, I didn't know if I would be able to get started. I'm honored to be here. I'm very thankful to have the opportunity to join you and to help add to your knowledge after last night about the moon. In fact, last night, as I was listening to Professor talk about the moon, I thought I could just go home. He has become a master of the moon for Brazil, and you were very lucky to have him here. So, and I'm very thankful also for the translators. I did not have time to learn Portuguese, so we have a translator, and he will translate any of your questions so that you can ask me whatever you want when we get to the end. I want to talk about the most fascinating object in this night sky, and that's a claim that you as amateur astronomers may want to disagree with, because each amateur astronomer likes to observe a certain type of object. You might like to observe Jupiter and Saturn, or deep sky objects like galaxies and nebulae. But I want to try to argue tonight that if you don't spend a lot of time looking at the moon, you are missing the most fascinating object in the solar system. You are missing a place where you have many opportunities to learn. And I think that's the purpose of my talk, to help you learn to read the moon. You have to learn to interpret what you see, and that will make it much more interesting, I hope. Now, is everything working? Can everybody hear me okay? It just started. Okay. What I said was, I'm happy to be here, and now we're going to start. Oops. Brazil, it turns out, has a history of studying the moon. In 1962, Rubens de Azevedo published a book on the moon in 1962, and I was a student in Arizona at the time, and I saw in Sky and Telescope magazine a notification that he had published this book. And so I wrote him a letter. There was no email. I wrote him a letter, and he sent me a copy and he autographed it. So I have here that book. And is Professor Florentino here? Ah. I want to pass it on to the new master. I collect books on the moon. I have more than 200, and now I have 199, and it has gone to a very good home. Oops. I want to talk about the moon and how you see it with your eyeball. Some of us saw the pictures this morning about taking photographs of the universe with cameras. You can do all sorts of marvelous things that we never had the opportunity to do before. But I'm interested in using the eyeball to observe. And I think that's where all of us start with astronomy. So I want to compare the moon to what you see through telescopes in different sizes. So here's 1/4 of the moon, taken by a man in England using a 12 centimeter diameter mirror. So with a small telescope, you can see thousands and thousands of features. Here's another drawing by somebody in England with a 36 centimeter telescope and a galaxy. You can hardly see that it exists. There may be hundreds of billions of stars there. There may be vast civilizations and trillions of moons, but from the Earth, from your backyard, with even a big telescope, you see a smudge. So the moon has much more to show you than any deep sky object in the universe. The moon is a place with thousands of locations, and you can explore each one. Now, in the front row, we have people who study galaxies, and I'm getting the eagle eye. Let's look now at the moon versus the solar system, and you notice these different photographs have patterns on them as to who's taking them. So here's one from a familiar photographer. We saw a version of the fascinante. And here's one crater on the moon, Copernicus, that we talked about yesterday, a little bit less than 100 kilometers across. Copernicus is this white thing. You can see it with your naked eye at night when the moon is full. And by comparison, this is the size with the same magnification at your telescope of the biggest planets in the solar system that you can observe, Jupiter and Saturn. So they could easily fit within one crater on the moon. And the moon has thousands and thousands of craters. So the moon is an infinitely large place with many, many locations to look at. And I want to tell you now, as you look at them, how to interpret what you're seeing. First of all, the moon is a special place in the universe. Only the Earth is a place that we have visited before. We've got millions of years, a couple million years of intelligent creatures here on this planet, exploring it by foot, exploring it by airplane with sensors, and we know a lot how the Earth works as a planet. The moon is the only other place we've been to. So the moon, we have a level of understanding of how it works that's much better than Mars or Jupiter or any galaxy or any place else in the universe. So the moon, we're already starting with a lot of knowledge. We know from the rocks that were brought back and dated in laboratories that the moon is 4.5 billion years old, the same age as the Earth, the same age as our sun. The sun and the planets and the moons and the solar system all formed at the same time. They're ancient compared to the normal things we look at on the Earth. But the universe is, as we heard yesterday, 15.8 billion years old. So the universe is about 3 times the age of the Earth and the moon. The universe is old. We're young in this neighborhood of the universe. The thing about the moon rocks that was unanticipated when they were brought back to Earth is that almost all of the gases have escaped from it. The moon at some point in its history was so hot that almost all of the gases, the volatiles, escaped into space at that time, probably when the moon formed. And so the moon is very dry, and because it's dry, it doesn't have any atmosphere. The moon has no atmosphere except a very tiny amount of carbon and a few other elements that escape due to cosmic rays and other things hitting the moon's surface and dislodging them from surface rocks. We've learned in the last 20 years that all the craters on the moon are formed by impact. Cosmic collisions of debris left over from the formation of the solar system, comets and asteroid fragments. There was a large controversy. In that book, they talk about it. We did not know for certain in the 1960s how the craters were formed. We now know that. We now know that the same process of high-speed cosmic impact causes craters on the Earth. There are a couple in Brazil. Causes craters on the moon. There are tens of thousands of them on Mars, on Venus, on Mercury, and all the icy satellites, icy and rocky moons of the Jovian planets. So impact cratering is the fundamental process in the solar system. And probably the same process occurs around all the other planets that are beyond our star. We've also learned by bringing back samples from Apollo that the Maria, the dark splotches that you see on the moon, are lava flows. But those are ancient lava flows. They erupted about 3.5 to 2.5 billion years ago. So the moon has had a continuing history of impact cratering, with most of them being in the first billion years, and a very small number now, but they continue. And the volcanism lasted only a couple of billion years or so at the very beginning. The moon, therefore, is ancient. It doesn't have life. It seems to be dead by a lot of people. And so they think the moon is boring. They are wrong. The moon may be a rock in space that does not have earthquakes or moonquakes or creatures crawling across the surface, but every time you look at the moon, the sun is at a different place in the sky above it. The shadows are longer or shorter. You can see small features that you could not notice before. The moon also wobbles in its orbit. It wobbles this way and this way. It nods and it goes up and down, yes and no. And that allows us to see about 57% of the surface of the moon. So we can see around the edge. And so if you want to if you observe the moon tonight after midnight, you'll see the sun lighting at a certain angle, and you'll see it tilted at a certain amount. That condition will not reoccur for another 18.6 years. So if you look at the moon every night for 18.6 years, it will be different every single time. If you want to see it exactly the same way, you have to come back 18.6 years later. So unless you've observed the moon at least every night for 18.6 years, you don't know it. And then you still have much to learn by continuing to look. Now, we have learned some new things since Apollo. Here's the same photograph as before, except the foreground, the front of it has been changed with Photoshop. The big discovery we've made in the last 5 years about the moon is that it is not bone dry as we thought. It has a small amount of water, never on the surface, it's a liquid. But the water is in the rock inside the moon. And if we can use instruments, scientific instruments in the laboratory to break apart the rock and to clinically analyze what the rock has in it. After Apollo in the 1970s, our instruments were not sensitive enough to actually detect the small amount of water that's in the rock. Now, in the 40 years since Apollo, scientific instrumentation has got much, much better, and we can now detect that rock. So we have to change some of our understanding. But that doesn't affect very much what you see when you look with your eye. It doesn't affect very much at all what the spacecraft see as the photograph straight down. When we're looking at the surface of the moon, the effects of the water are non-existent. So there's water in the lunar poles. The purple and blue images here are places where there's water ice. A comet hits the moon at high velocity. A comet contains a lot of water, frozen water, and it contains the rocks. There's a vaporization goes into the vapor and moves around the moon. And the poles in these bottoms of the craters are always dark. The sun never shines in the floors. So the condensation of the water vapor from the comet can settle there and remain for billions of years. So that is a place where we can track what the comet water composition has been over the history of the solar system. We can also use that water to drink when we go to the moon and to make rocket fuel. So it's going to be a scarce resource that we don't want to fritter away. And the most important value of it is not to drink or not for rocket fuel, but for the information it contains about the history of the solar system. Let me reintroduce you to the moon as a satellite. It is a very strange satellite. It's so much bigger than any other moon except Pluto's moon Charon. It's about it's about 1/4 the diameter of the Earth. So the moon is very large. We talk about the Earth and the moon system almost being the whole planet. And we believe now that the reason the moon is really large is that it's formed in a different fashion than all the other moons around all the other planets. If you look at Jupiter and Saturn, Uranus and Neptune, they have many, many moons. They're a small solar system. And those moons probably formed at the same time that Jupiter or Saturn was formed. The condensation of dust and gas that was rotating in each of those moons started out with a concentration of consolidated light. Our moon, as everybody has heard, we think formed by a giant collision onto the Earth, when the Earth had finished most of its formation about 4.5 billion years ago. A giant planetesimal object that would have become its own planet if it had not collided with the early Earth. We think caused a lot of material from the upper layers of the Earth's rocks and shot into space. The Earth was surrounded by a ring like Saturn, and those particles.
Não, avisa pra ele que as caixas de som estão falhando.
We have a very strange.
Avisa pra ele que as caixas de som estão parando de funcionar e voltando. Não é o áudio, não. Não é o microfone, não.
So we said the moon has no air, no water, no life. It's possible. And the really amazing thing about it is it's a giant museum.
Só tá
The
dando
moon
aqui.
has not changed very much in the last 2 to 3 billion years. There are young craters like Tycho and Copernicus, but in general, almost everything you see here is older than 3 billion years. If you look at the Earth, you go out and look at the rocks of Brazil and look at the rocks everywhere on the Earth. The average age of the Earth, when you count the ocean floors and the rocks above sea level, the average age of the surface of the Earth is 1/2 billion years, 500 million years. The average age of the moon is about 3.8 billion years. The moon preserves the earliest history of our area of the solar system. All of the impact craters that bombarded the moon and made its surface the way it is today, the same thing happened to the Earth. Except the Earth is a dynamic planet. We have volcanoes erupting continuously, not just billions of years ago. We have glaciers that flow back and forth. We have waters that come inland as seas and oceans and deposit sediments, and we have rivers that cut through the rocks. We have mountains that are uplifted, plate tectonics that moves things around. So the Earth's surface is very dynamic, and it has been the entire history of the planet. To find rocks on the Earth that are as old as these is almost impossible. An ancient rock on the Earth is one like these lava flows, which are among the young rocks on the moon, that are about 3 billion years old. So here we have, side by side, the most dynamic planet in the solar system, showing what a large, massive planet can evolve to. And with the same building blocks at the moon, we have a museum. This shows the before view of probably all the planets in the solar system. The other thing about the moon that we see very much more clearly than the Earth is that all of the important processes that form the surface are just two things: impact cratering and volcanism. Every place in the solar system that we look, we believe there's impact cratering and volcanism. Some planets have more. Mars has a lot of wind. Mars, maybe in the past, had flowing water. Venus is, at least for the last half billion years, been very hot and has had no processes except wind erosion and volcanism and impact cratering. So each planet has its own story, but the common thing that's basic to every planet is this: impact cratering and volcanism. And by the way, I mentioned that each of these photos has a caption and a credit. From the lunar photo of the day for 11 years, people from all over the world would send me photographs, and I would pick some nice one and write a caption about them, a little essay every night for over 3,000 nights. So some of these, all of these, in fact, are pictures that people have sent from all over the world. And the interesting thing is, yes, people in Lebanon, even though they have had a very difficult history, people in Iraq and Iran who have had a very difficult history, people in Russia send photographs of the moon. People everywhere are fascinated by the moon and want to study it and want to learn more. Even people in Brazil. When you want to read the landscape of the moon or of Mars, if you have spacecraft photographs, what you can do is look at a couple of things that are happening. Oops, a couple of processes. First of all, how did the feature you're looking at form? Mostly it's impact craters, or volcanism, or tectonics, which is fracturing of the crust. On the moon, all of that fracturing of the crust was due to impact cratering. And then how were the features modified? What happened to them after they're formed? And again, impact cratering, volcanism, tectonism changes them. And when you look at these features, you can see that some have sharper rims or more degraded, bright rim crest. Some are on top of each other. So you can easily figure out, at least locally, the age sequence, which is young and which is old. And geologists have done that starting with the Copernicus area on the moon, and they have mapped the entire moon. So every large crater on the moon, there's a assignment that this is a very old crater, this is a medium age crater, or this is a young crater, by this age sequence mapping, and we'll see examples of that. And that's this right here. What's the relations between the different parts? The composition of the moon is hard to get by using your eyeball. Really, we need to bring back rocks and analyze them in the laboratory, or we need to have spectrometers that we can measure the reflectivity of the lunar rocks in different wavelengths. But what you can do with your eye is you can look at the brightness or the albedo, the reflectivity of different parts of the moon, especially when the moon is full. When the moon is full, you don't see shadows, so all you see is the difference in reflectivity. And the biggest difference is the lava flows are dark. And we know from the samples brought back, that's basaltic lava. So using your eyeballs, every time you find dark material on the moon, smooth, you've identified its composition. It's a basaltic lava. When you look at things that are different, slightly different colors, you can say they must be different. They must not be basaltic lava, maybe another kind. And the most important thing about reading the landscapes of the moon is looking at the impact basins. The moon is made up of craters, and the smallest craters you can see in an electron scanning microscope. They're tiny fractions of a centimeter across. The largest craters are over 1,000 kilometers across. And those largest craters are what we call basins, and they are the ones that totally control the landscape of the moon. On the Earth, we look at continents, and we say, okay, I can look at this continent by itself, and that's a geologic unit separated by oceans that are created by continent spreading that separate them. On the moon, it's the basins that define the basic geology. So let's start, first of all, as we saw last night, with impact craters and talk about how they're formed and what they look like. Here's one of the best impact craters on the moon, Copernicus. This is a picture from a guy in England. It's about 93 kilometers across. From the rim crest up here to the floor is about 4 kilometers. So, and this is steep. Right here where it's very bright is a slope of about 35 degrees. There's no way you can drive a vehicle from outside Copernicus inside. So when we talk about having people living there and traveling there in the future, there will be many places you can't reach by any normal vehicle. It may be that what we need to do is develop a rocket that can land here and explore this area, and then take off again and land inside the floor of Copernicus or some other crater of interest. Big craters like this have terraces. The rocks were not strong enough when there was a giant excavation and removed material, so the sides of the holes in the ground just collapsed. They couldn't support themselves, so they collapsed down in broad pieces called terraces, and each one here continues tens of kilometers, and they're often tilted backwards towards the rim, and you can tell that because there's lava, there's melted material that occurs in places like this, and it's back towards the outer edge of the crater. There's central mountains. These form by the rebound of the ground when the projectile comes down at high velocity. It compresses the ground underneath, and as the shock wave passes, the ground rebounds and bounces back up. It's almost like Jell-O. If you push down on Jell-O without fracturing it too much, it'll bounce back up. So the central mountains of craters are bringing up rocks that were originally about 10 kilometers below the surface. So if you look at the rim, you can see what the surface rocks are, what their composition was. But if you look at the central mountains, you're looking down at the composition of rocks that are buried out of sight. No other way to access that information. We often say that craters are these big, deep holes in the moon. Well, if this is 100 kilometers across and it's only 4 kilometers deep, we should not think of a crater as sort of a cup or a glass. The crater is actually the plate that you would put a teacup onto, the saucer. That's what the crater's shape is like. This saucer is leaking. When the hole was excavated, a tremendous amount of rock is fragmented, broken up, and thrown out. It's called ejecta. And that ejecta falls back down around, making secondary impact craters. It makes these features that radiate away, ridges. It goes further away, hundreds and thousands of kilometers away. And on some date, about this Copernicus is about 1 billion years old, a little bit less than that. Sometime on Earth, about 1 billion years ago, rocks fell out of the sky from Copernicus.
every time there's a big impact crater formed on the moon, we get moon rocks that fall to Earth. And the same thing must have happened in the past when there were big impact craters formed on Earth. Some of the ejecta would go to the moon, or it would go to Mars, or it would travel widely throughout the solar system. Over here is a simple crater. Craters smaller than about 10 or 15 kilometers. They're just bowls. They're simple bowls carved out of the ground. The rock is strong enough to not collapse, so it doesn't have terraces. Further away from Copernicus, in a lava flow area, you can see these bright rays. That's the pulverized ejecta from Copernicus. And you can see a whole series of small craters, typically 1 or 2 kilometers or so across, that are in those rays. So those are the secondary craters. And because they're digging into and deposited on top of this big lava flow, this is Mare Imbrium lavas, we know that Copernicus is younger than those lavas. So there's the beginning of a time sequence. Here's another crater that we saw last night that's similar to Copernicus. It's Theophilus. It's 100 kilometers across, very, very much like Copernicus, with a terrace, large central peak. And here's nearby Cyrillus, about the same size. And Cyrillus has been smashed upon by Copernicus. And so you'd automatically know that Copernicus is younger than this one because it's on top of it. And if you look at the rim here, the rim is very much degraded. It's soft, we say. It's not sharp like this. So there's 2 different pieces of evidence. The center is filled in with ejecta from here. This is deep, this is shallow. So you can begin to see, okay, here's why this crater no longer looks like that one. It probably did look like that when it was formed, but it was instantaneously aged, instantaneously degraded by the formation of this. And then up here you can see half of another crater called Torricelli, which is almost the same size, and there's just a small amount of its rim left. Here's ejecta from Theophilus that's going down on top of it. So definitely Theophilus is younger than that. The degraded rim says it's old, and the whole floor has been filled in from lavas from outside that have flowed inside. So this is very much an older crater than this one, and this is the youngest. Again, an example from last night. This is the crater Archimedes, and the names of the craters were given starting in the 1600s. The first person who made a map of the moon gave names to many craters. The second person who made a map of the moon, even though he had the first map, totally ignored it and gave his own names for the craters. The third person who made a map of the moon did the same thing. So within about 10 years from when the first map was made in 1647, there were 3 different sets of names for the craters on the moon. That caused a great deal of controversy, and the third set of names became the one that stuck, that people still use today. We've added many names to it. And the early names were after ancient Greek philosophers and scientists like Archimedes, and then more modern scientists like Copernicus. And we've continued to add the names through time of more recent scientists. So there is an Einstein crater on the moon, for example. So craters on the moons, the big ones have names, and it makes it a lot easier to remember them when you're saying, oh yeah, look at Archimedes, rather than saying, look at latitude and longitude, these numbers. Nobody would remember those. Archimedes was probably formed like Copernicus with terraces. They're still there with ejecta and with the central peak. And the central peak is totally missing. And it's missing because there's lava, the same as this lava out here, that's flooded up the fractures underneath and filled it in. And you can calculate how deep a new crater of that size should be. And this is so deep that there must be at least 2.5 kilometers of lava filling the floor of that. And the first scientific paper I published was another correlation between how tall a central mountain is in a crater compared to the diameter of the crater. And so from the crater diameter, you can calculate how high the central mountain was, the central peak on the floor, and it was only 2 kilometers, so it's been buried. There's a central mountain there, but it's buried. It's hidden under the lava. This is another interesting way in which craters can be modified. This is a wonderful crater on the moon that has a lava floor and it has fractures all around it. You see the lava has filled it up, just the top of the central peak is filled. And these fractures...
Dear Charles Wood, wait a moment. Your microphone failed. Could you use this?
Okay. Hi, my name is Chuck Wood. I'm starting over. Thank you. We think the way that this crater formed right here and deformed, this was a Copernicus-like crater when it started. We think the way it deformed is just like this pie crust. You make a pie with apples in there. The pie crust is smooth across the top. As you bake the pie and it heats up, the gases escape from the apple and it raises the crust. And at the place where the crust has to bend up around the edges, there's a lot of stress there. And after the gases escape, the crust collapses and you have these fractures. So and there's even a central peak by accident. So that's probably what happened to this crater. This crater was filled with lava. The lava had a lot of gas in it, and it domed up like this. The dome of lava froze in place, it cooled in place. The gases escaped. In the lunar gravity, even though it's only 1/6 as much as Earth's gravity, it caused this to collapse, fracturing around the edges. So the next time you have a pie, think about the moon. Now, when we think of craters, we always showed diagrams of a projectile coming straight down and hitting the surface, excavating a hole, throwing debris out in all directions. Well, one of the arguments that was used against impact being the reason for the formation of lunar craters, 100 years ago, the argument was made, well, not all projectors will fall straight down. Some will come at different angles. And so the craters should be gouged out. They should be elongated, not circular. And that's a pretty strong argument, except that back then we did not understand the tremendous energy of an impact. If a projectile is coming into the moon, it's moving at least 5 kilometers a second. And if that projectile is from a comet, it could be moving 70 kilometers per second. So the amount of energy that's released when the projectile hits the surface is more than any energy that's released by the largest eruption on Earth or by the largest earthquake on Earth. This is truly unfathomable amount of energy instantaneously released at one place. And so in general, no matter what the angle is, the crater is circular because there's a point source release of energy. But some NASA scientists in California in the 70s said, well, what happens when the projectile is coming in really low, when it's grazing? And so they made a gun that could shoot very tiny projectiles at 3 or 4 kilometers per second. So you had that high energy impact. And they discovered that the crater's rays, first of all, are the things that are affected. When the angle is about 25 degrees, here's the horizon, it's coming in at 25 degrees. The rays are not circular. The rays have an area where they go out from the crater, but there's an area back here where there are no rays. And we call that the zone of avoidance. And the projectile comes from this direction, moving that way. It hits the ground at a low angle, and the momentum causes the rays to go downrange.
Ei. Som, teste, 1, 2.
O som tá saindo lá embaixo, o teste. Tá não. Ah, acabou de falar aqui, ó.
Tá não, tá mudado aqui.
Mas acabou de falar, gente, que é isso, o teste. Não tá saindo lá embaixo.
Tá ouvindo? Pergunta se tá ouvindo.
Tá saindo lá embaixo, ó.
Impossível, gente.
Viu?
The rays are like railway tracks. They're all going parallel to each other in the...
Pergunta se ela vai ouvir.
Tem que olhar com a câmera. Calma que nós vamos olhar, gente. Estamos resolvendo. Cada hora uma coisa. Espera aí, pede para guardar que nós vamos olhar. Tem Wi-Fi disponível aqui?
Tem. Mas tem que ter um login. O que você está precisando?
Professor Armando, vem aqui. Pode testar.
Testando.
Tá testando.
Tá saindo embaixo?
Deu pau. Tá saindo, não. Deu pau o microfone dele aí de novo, gente?
Cadê a capinha? Funcionando normal.
Tá funcionando o microfone.
Tem mais um? Não, né?
Só isso. Só isso.
Lá não tá funcionando agora?
Tô pensando nas essas de perguntas.
Ah, não, a gente tá olhando isso aqui.
Podia fazer o seguinte, podia pedir do William para traduzir para ele. A do William traduzir.
Professor, na sessão
A do William é astrônomo, né? Que é mais fácil. Agora, e alguém fala com o outro. Então tem 2 microfones para fazer isso, além do dele.
Professor, no sem fio,
Pega um-
para ele falar no com fio que está no púlpito, aí você se com 2 sem fio.
Entendi. Olha,
Tá.
a gente pode fazer diferente.
Ok.
Aqui, professor. Tá vendo que ali tem um microfone com fio?
Na mesa tem
Na
um
mesa.
e no púlpito tem um.
Aí na hora das
Pede
perguntas,
a do
eu
William
acho
pra
que
ir pra
pode
lá,
sentar
né?
os 2 na mesa para na hora das perguntas, entendeu? E aí a gente pega os 2 sem fio para rodar.
Known and understood craters have mysteries that we're still learning about. And I don't talk about it in here today, but when you look at the big basins, the biggest craters on the moon, turns out some of them were oblique impacts also. Some of them came down at a low angle and threw a huge amount of ejecta away from the moon, and that probably shot off into space to hit Earth or to go to Venus or who knows where. Another way that impact craters are modified is that here's a big one, Clavius, about 245 kilometers across. Clavius is about 5 kilometers deep here compared to its rim. And these 2 craters, Rutherford and Porter, formed on the rim. So they formed on a sloping piece of ground like that. And the craters therefore are tilted. This rim is much higher than that. And so from the very beginning, these craters were different than normal. If you look at these 2 craters, Porter and Rutherford, can you get an idea which one might be older and which one younger? Yes, you had a... P is older because darker? How about the rim? What about the rim? The sharpness of the rim, right? This rim is very sharp and fresh. This one is rounded and eroded. So just from the rim, you can tell that this is younger. But also, if you look down here, you can see ejecta, and there's even a line of secondary craters from this one, and that's completely missing here. This smooth material on the floor of Clavius has covered the ejecta from that crater. So once again, you can determine the local stratigraphy, the local sequence of events, just by looking carefully. And the thing is, you can see all of this in your backyard with your telescope. You don't have to have pictures from space to see it. You don't have to have some fancy scientist from the United States come and tell you. You can look yourself. Everywhere on the moon, you can look. There's 3 features. Which one's oldest? How do I know? What's the evidence? You can become a lunar scientist just by looking through your eyepiece. And that's exciting. The moon becomes much more interesting when you yourself personally interpret it. 10 minutes, okay, thank you. The biggest features on the moon are the impact basins. And here's one down here. These are typically hundreds to 1,000 kilometers across. They send ejecta all over the moon. They bury craters nearby so that you can hardly see them. So anytime there's a basin nearby, there's going to be all sorts of changes to the existing scenery. So here's a basin called the Sea of Serenity, 680 kilometers, and it's completely filled in with lava, so its inner floor is completely covered. On the edge of Serenity here, you can see a black lava and a lighter lava, and an astronaut photograph of it from Apollo 17 shows that this black lava has more impact craters on it. Here's an impact crater that formed right on the edge, and the side that's near the light-colored lava, it's been eaten away. Its rim has been eroded. So this is younger than this. This was old. It probably extended underneath all the way to the center of the basin, but this younger lava has erupted on top of it. Here's another basin, an impact basin. Here's the center of it. It's a circular feature. And on the edge, just like that piece of pie, as the center of the basin subsided because of the weight of the lava, these fractures, these rills form all around it. Those are faults. Those are tectonic features. Here's the same basin here with those fractures. And all of these craters formed on the edge, so they're tilted in. And then when the lava flows came, they destroyed the walls. Here's another large crater about 200 kilometers across. In its wall facing the middle of the lava flows completely eroded away. Here's another crater right here that we saw last night. And the wall over here is completely eroded away. And there's evidence here what happened. There's a fault. This side here is about almost 500 meters higher than this side. So the lava on this side collapsed down. So we think in some of these craters, like here, and maybe over there, and this one, there's a fault that occurs. The center of the lava subsides, and it cuts the crater right in half. Here's that same picture we saw taken by a famous photographer in Brazil. Here's another fault on the moon taken by a famous photographer in Greece. So there's only a couple of these on the moon. We have a lot of faults on the Earth, but only a couple on the moon. And we said that the lava flows, the Maria, are lava flows. Well, in most places, they're so old, 3 billion years old, that the edges are eroded and you can't see them. But here's a lava flow that's not so old, and you can actually see the edges of it. And this picture was taken by an amateur astronomer in Hong Kong who lives on about the 40th floor of a high-rise apartment building. So he takes his telescope out on his balcony, and he can only observe the moon when it's risen above the neighboring buildings. So he only can see the moon a few hours a day, and he takes marvelous photos. Here's another type of volcanic feature, a little volcano cone. It's called a Shield Volcano, right there. These are very common in Hawaii. If you go to Hawaii, you can see volcanoes like this. So that sort of volcanism occurs on the moon. And then some craters along fracture zones, there are other craters that have dark halos around them. That dark halo material is volcanic ash. So these are some of the actual volcanic craters. This is not volcanic, that's an impact crater, but the lava has come up and filled the floor, and the lava has colonized the impact crater. Well, what can you as an amateur do? First of all, I don't think you have to feel you need to do useful work at all. If you go to Egypt to see the pyramids, do you think you have to measure the heights of them or something so you can write a scientific paper? You go because you want to explore personally, you want to understand how ancient Egypt lived. When you look at the moon through the telescope, it's the same thing. You are personally exploring, you're learning for yourself to see if things that people tell you are true and to see if you can find other things that are different. So you don't have to feel guilty if you're not doing whatever useful work might be. But it turns out it's easy to do useful work on the moon. For example, you can have a video camera attached to your telescope that photographs the nighttime side of the moon, and every once in a while you'll see a bright flash like that. That's caused by a meteor. On the Earth, it would be burnt up in our atmosphere. On the moon, it reaches the surface, it explodes, it makes an impact crater, and with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter spacecraft, we can now discover impact craters that we see forming by flashes. So from your backyard with a video camera, you may discover a flash. You send that information to NASA. NASA looks in that location to see if between some of the earlier photographs and the later ones, they find new craters. This crater is about 10 meters across. It could easily fit in this room. The first couple seats here could have been wiped out by a small crater forming. I'm sorry. So you can observe for flashes. The other thing you can do is the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, this wonderful spacecraft that's in orbit around the moon that shows us things. We can see the astronauts landing vehicles on the moon. We can see where they trudged across the surface and destroyed the soil or disturbed the soil. You can look yourself for certain types of features. So this is a kind of small crater that has an inner ring, sort of a donut inside it. I published a list of these in 1972 or 3, and a doctor in Florida used the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter to look at all of these to get the best ever pictures of them, and to begin to have better ideas than I had in 1970 whatever about how they're formed, because the data are now better. And I have a couple of resources that you can use to learn more about the moon. For 11 years, every night I published a lunar photo of the day. And here's a picture by our colleague here on the front row. One of his photographs, excellent photographs of the moon. And using Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, you can measure the topography now. So you can do something we could never easily do before. So the lunar photo of the day, every one of those pictures from the beginning 11 years ago is reappearing day by day, starting January 1st, 2015, and they're available. Another resource is the Moon Wiki, and for every named crater on the moon, we have a page that shows you photographs of it, it shows you where the maps are, what scientific papers have been published, and we have over 3,000 pages, and all of those pages have been contributed by members of the amateur astronomy community. And I look at every one of them myself to see that they're right. I published 3 books about the moon, which you should definitely buy multiple copies of. Christmas is coming up, you know, buy them for your friends. I'm sorry they're in English, they're not in Portuguese. This is one that I was asked to co-author with a Japanese scientist. Japan sent a spacecraft in orbit around the moon, but they could build a spacecraft, but they didn't have scientists who knew about the moon. So they asked me what they should photograph on the moon. And so I gave them a long list of targets for them to image. And thanks for that. When they were ready to publish a book, they asked me to be a co-author and to select the photographs and write the descriptions. Also, I published in Sky and Telescope about 10 years ago a Messier list for the moon. If you look at galaxies and nebula in the sky, the best place to start is Messier's list of objects that he kept confusing with comets. He was not interested in those things. He wanted to discover comets. And so he made his list of things to avoid. But that's a great list of things for you as an amateur astronomer to look at, to see the highlights of the sky. I made a Messier list for the moon, 100 objects. Oops. What happened to the image? 100 oops. If you get seasick, don't look. Or moon sick. Finished now? Yep. This list of Lunar 100 objects is in Sky and Telescope. You can buy it as a little card on the back that describes what each of these objects is and why it's important. These are not just random objects. Each one tells you part of the story of how the moon formed and evolved, or about the history of the moon's exploration. So this is a handy list to sort of figure out where to go on the moon. And what I encourage you to do is keep observing at the moon, at Mars, at Jupiter, at distant galaxies. Every time you observe, you see something new. Every time you observe, you learn, you become a better astronomer. I get paid to do astronomy. I've worked for NASA all my life, and yet I still have 4 telescopes that I take out to different doors and different patios to look to see every night that it's clear, and I encourage you to do the same thing. And I hope after seeing this quick succession of slides that you now know more about the moon, so you'll never look at it the same way again. You will always now see it more clearly and with a more of an educated eye, and it will draw you back time after time, I hope. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. Agora nós teremos rápido momento para não atrasarmos o evento. Talvez 2 questões. Eu quero convidar a palestrante, a senhora Duília, para acompanhar o professor Wood para ajudar neste momento. Então, eu peço a compreensão de todos, né? O tempo já está avançado. Nós teremos, então, aí 2 questões ao professor Wood.
Are there some questions?
Dear teacher, vou fazer a pergunta em português para todos entenderem. Existem teorias de que as crateras foram formadas, na verdade, de segundo antes dos bólidos se checarem contra a superfície, em função da alta energia, das ondas de energia vindo junto com esses bólidos. Essa teoria é aceita, é relevante ou é apenas uma especulação?
I've never heard of that theory. And for a wave to move forward in advance of the projectile, there would have to be some
medium for it to move through, an atmosphere or a fluid or something. So I don't know of this theory, and my explanation for why it may not be right may be completely wrong.
Em português. Você poderia nos dar uma ideia da frequência com que caem meteoritos na nossa face visível da Lua, em números, em número e em peso? Você tem um número assim que pode nos mostrar?
Right. Before we had the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter spacecraft that could photograph things as small as 1/2 a meter, we could not see the craters that are being formed nowadays. I think the largest crater that we have seen form is about 40 meters across. And so in the last 7 years, we have seen 200 or 300 craters form, and so we now have statistics on the size of the crater and therefore the energy, and through time. So we have, yes, for the first time, some numbers, and it's not too different from what we had speculated with before. I'm going to take this off because I keep hearing myself in Portuguese. It was not very difficult than what we had speculated before, very different, because we said how many meteors of different sizes come into the Earth's atmosphere, and probably there'd be about the same number of craters formed on the moon as there are shooting stars in the Earth, and that's about right. The other thing we have done is we have exactly the same sort of high-resolution camera in orbit around Mars, and we've been discovering new craters on Mars. So now for the moon and for Mars, we have impact cratering rates, and that'll help us calibrate the age scales that we use to estimate the ages of older features on these planets.
Professor Wood, muito boa tarde. Boa tarde a todos também. Uma pergunta até mesmo relacionada ao título do seu último slide. A Lua nunca mais será a mesma. Ok. Uma vez que nós, astrônomos amadores, ou então apreciadores da ciência espacial, e o senhor, um agente que trabalhou para o governo americano, ou seja, a NASA, quando é a melhor perspectiva de uma nova presença humana na superfície lunar?
I think you were asking the wrong person. You should ask a Chinaman. The United States has no program to return to the moon of any consequence. The United States is becoming a third-rate space power in terms of humans traveling. We can't even go to Earth orbit by ourselves. We hitch a ride on a Russian spacecraft. So we continue to send magnificent spacecraft out to the planets, but we're not going back to the moon in any meaningful way in my lifetime. The Chinese have launched 2 spacecraft to orbit the moon, 1 lander. They have another lander that's going to go next year and return a sample of the moon to the Earth. The Chinese say that by 2022, 2023, something like that, they will send humans to the moon. You might have just seen recently that the Russians have announced that they're going to send people back to the moon by 2029. Maybe by then, the United States will have awakened to the value of continuing space exploration, and we will be sending people too. And what I like to say when I talk to school kids is you might be one of those people who go to the moon. You might be one of those people who go to Mars. It's not going to be the old folks, not her, like me. It's going to be the young folks. So one of the important things we need to do is to let young people understand the excitement of planetary exploration, the wonderful things we learn by sending spacecraft to the moon and Mars and Jupiter and Saturn, so that they can be bitten by the same space bug that many of us were during Apollo. You know, you're probably grew up like me with Apollo, and that probably made you interested in the moon all your life. It has me. So we need to find ways to capture young people's interest so that they will be ready to be the scientists and the engineers and the astronauts of the near future. Please do.
I'll tell you that later in English. Eu quero aproveitar aí a pergunta para fazer uma previsão. Gostaria que vocês anotassem aí, tá? A previsão que eu tenho é que a China vai mandar a primeira mulher astronauta a pisar na Lua. Isso nunca foi falado na mídia, não? Isso é uma previsão pessoal minha que eu estou fazendo. Porque, como nunca houve uma mulher astronauta, né, 12 homens andaram na Lua, né, a China provavelmente vai tentar mandar a primeira mulher. Vamos torcer, né, mulheres aí da plateia, para a China mandar mesmo uma mulher para andar na Lua. Então, the prediction I'm making is that China will send the first woman to the moon.
I think you're right. China will send the first woman to the moon and the next man. And who knows, maybe they'll send dogs and cats. That's how we started. The Russians first sent into orbit around the Earth animals. You know, remember Laika, the dog the Russians sent into orbit? Perhaps we'll have animals going with us to the moon.
First of all, I would like to thank you for your wonderful conference. I think that I'm going to ask the question in Portuguese,
okay,
and then you translate.
No, he has a translation.
That's great. Há estimativas de que durante a fase de impactos violentos no início da história da Terra, centenas de toneladas de material terrestre foram lançadas e depositadas na Lua. Right. Você tem uma ideia de como que essas estimativas elas estão em andamento? E se isso não seria uma base para uma presença forte de seres humanos na Lua? Ou seja, pesquisar não só a história geológica primitiva da Terra, mas também, quem sabe, microfósseis terrestres que tivessem sido lançados na Lua e estivessem lá até hoje.
Yeah. The rate of cratering on the moon and on Earth and Mars and all the planets was millions of times higher 4.5 billion years ago than it is today. So there was a tremendous building up. That's the way the moon was built. That's the way the Earth was built, by projectiles, planetesimals, colliding and sticking together. If they collided too fast, they would break apart and fragment. But if they collided at the right speed, they would stick together and grow. They would accrete and make the planets. And so every single one of those collisions formed an impact crater. And there were billions and billions of impact craters everywhere. Since about 3.9 billion years ago, that heavy period of crater formation has just fallen off, has declined very much. And now, 4.5 billion years since the beginning, it's a very low level. almost all tiny projectiles, almost all small impact craters. When we looked at the moon, we saw Tycho. Tycho is a very young, big crater on the moon. It's about 80 kilometers across, and it was formed 100 million years ago. That's a young crater on the moon, 100 million years. 100 million years, there were dinosaurs eating, roaming here. This was Jurassic Park movie locale. So the moon was when the dinosaurs were roaming. So probably some ejecta from Tycho came to the Earth. 65 million years ago, that's when a giant impact crater formed in the Yucatan Peninsula on the Earth in Mexico. And that crater's 100 kilometers across or more. And so there was debris sent from Earth 65 million years ago. There were a lot of microfossils. So there very well could have been microfossils caught up in that debris that was shocked and sent into space to the moon and to Mars. So some scientists have philosophized and guesstimated that there may in fact have been transfer of living material between the Earth and Mars, maybe from Mars and Earth. In the very earliest days that might have happened. But the energies of those impacts were so giant, probably that any living things were sterilized in most cases.
Ok.
A última questão, por favor.
Ok. Com relação à quantidade, ao número, enfim, a distribuição de crateras na face voltada para a Terra e na face distante, eu tenho uma lembrança de que na face distante é muito maior o número de crateras, provavelmente porque a Terra funciona como um escudo gravitacional, né? Você tem ideia da quantidade ou de que fração é maior do outro lado, em número de crateras?
The Earth does act as a gravitational shield, and the moon acts as a gravitational shield to the Earth. There's been calculations that have shown that if the moon has not been around us for the last 4.5 billion years, we would have had far more impacts on Earth, so that in early Earth, the earliest fossils we have, microscopic fossils, are about 3.9 billion years ago. That's when the high level of impact cratering on the moon dropped very much. So there may have been life formed earlier on Earth, but it was constantly destroyed by very large impact cratering events. And if we did not have the moon, more of those would have happened. So maybe life would have been delayed another 500 million years of, pure speculation. It might have been delayed. But dynamical astronomers have done calculations, I don't know the answers exactly, about exactly how the Earth protects the moon and vice versa. But all sides of the moon would be impacted, not just, or all sides would be protected, not just the side facing the Earth. Poor Mars has two tiny little satellites, hardly worth nothing. And they've never provided any protection to Mars. So Mars has not had that satellite barrier.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. Nós vamos encerrar agora as atividades da apresentação. Eu agradeço a participação do palestrante, também da palestrante do Ilha de Melo, por ter acompanhado o Sr. Wood. Eu quero lembrar a todos que, repetindo os avisos do início das atividades, que os interessados em participar mais tarde da atividade Estação Espaço do Conhecimento, que vai acontecer a partir das 19 horas na Praça da Liberdade, deve fazer imediatamente. Aproveite agora o intervalo, o rápido intervalo, para fazer a inscrição, porque são apenas 60 vagas para participar, então, da atividade na Praça da Liberdade às 19 horas. Eu quero lembrar a todos também a alteração no programa do encontro. Nós não teremos a palestra intitulada Ensino de Astronomia para Crianças, com a palestrante Marjorie Nascimento, que cancelou a sua participação no evento e, infelizmente, tivemos essa alteração. Portanto, a palestra História de Meteoritos Brasileiros, com a senhora Elizabeth Zucoloto vai acontecer aqui ao lado, na sala 309. Nós teremos agora a palestra com o palestrante Amâncio Friaça, intitulada Água no Sistema Solar e Além, desvelando a habitabilidade do universo. Eu peço às pessoas que vão se deslocar para as outras atividades e aqueles interessados na inscrição na atividade na Praça da Liberdade, não se esqueçam, portanto, na recepção, na entrada deste teatro, fazer a